Judge, real quick on the cameras. Again, I'll go back to my Iraq and Afghan experience where I had a lot of political and development work that I did there.
Right.
And what you're seeing there is the fruit of tens of millions of dollars that have been put through USAID into some type of media contract, media development program. So what you're seeing there is a showing off of what likely tens of millions of dollars of American taxpayer dollars, right, have gone for.
Yeah. Right. I mean, that is a higher quality production than the president of the United States gets when he's in the East Room. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but you're right. They outsourced that to some entity, probably Ukrainian, paid them twice or three times what they're worth because it's not their money. It's other people's money. It's the money that we printed or borrowed and sent over there. Let me ask you, who or what succeeds President Zelensky? Do you know?
Oh gosh, Judge, you quoted Kissinger. I'll quote Yogi Berra in terms, predictions are hard, especially when they're about the future, right? And I don't know. I mean, it certainly would, if this proceeds apace, and it proceeds apace in two ways, if there's a collapse, God knows what happens. If there's a collapse like we are all fearing, and I don't think anyone here is rooting for a collapse because we know what those consequences mean, the flood of refugees into the rest of Europe, the potential for further conflict, the fact that you would have a breakup of Ukraine potentially, and all those billions and billions of dollars of weapons going to where, let alone the potential of Poland going into Ukraine, Romania going into Ukraine, coming into contact with Russian forces. I mean, the idea of a collapse is a nightmare. And so what would come out of that? Who knows? But in terms of the other possibility, which is minimal, but it's a possibility I think we're all cheering for and hoping for and advocating for or working for, that of a negotiated political settlement. Would the Russians be okay with the Zelensky government staying in place? I don't think so. I think most people would say that's preposterous, this idea the Russians would allow him to stay. And also, too, I don't know if Zelensky has that political capital to do so. And so I think what you'd have to see is you'd see some type of transition. Now, the problem being is that those who are strongest in Ukraine right now politically are those to Zelensky's right. There is not a block of powerful pro-negotiation, pro-peace, if you will, pro-reconciliation politicians within Ukraine who I think the United States, the Brits, NATO would be able to massage into power. That is in spite of what we know about where the Ukrainian people are on this war. I think we brought it up last time or 2 weeks ago, where there was a poll at the end of March in Ukraine that showed more Ukrainians by a minimal factor, 45 to 44%, but more Ukrainians support negotiations, them fighting on to victory, whatever victory means.
Aren't the people to his right, the Nazis that the Russians absolutely loathe? They're no more going to negotiate with that crowd than they will with Zelensky himself. Am I right?
That's exactly right. And that's one of when you start getting into negotiations, why potentially the Russians could allow for Zelensky to stay is because who else is there? So because that certainly that far right ultra nationalist Nazi power base in Ukraine, which dominated Ukrainian politics following the 2014 coup, which heavy relationship, tight relationship with the Americans and the British. Well, that is, of course, anathema. That's one of the points of the Russian invasion, right? One of their goals was denazification. So this idea of who would replace Zelensky, those on the right aren't in favor of negotiations anyway. Some of them might take something to have power, but the overall idea of negotiations is anathema to them just as much as having them in power is anathema to the Russians. So this idea of, okay, who then takes power? I mean, there are those there. I shouldn't be saying there's nobody, because there's Klitschko, there's others that could go into a position like that. And I'm certain the Americans have a list. or I shouldn't say that. You would imagine the Americans would have a list, but that's imagining that's even a greater degree of imagination that the Americans have the competency, the wisdom, and humility to be preparing for such a thing. My experience would be something like that would be, you don't talk about that because that goes counter to what our narrative is. So don't even bring it up, because if Blinken or Sullivan, hear about this, they're going to be really upset.
So maybe the State Department calls Columbia University and brings Mrs. Newland back for a few weeks. I mean, she's very experienced at overthrowing Ukrainian governments. We know that.
I mean, certainly there are, and oftentimes it's people you never hear of who come into power. So it's those who are very good behind the scenes. But it's certainly, this idea is an intriguing one if you got to this point of negotiations. Russia has made it clear before they weren't interested in decapitating the Ukrainian government, and they could have at any point in the last 26, 27 months. I think it's pretty clear they could have put a Kinzhal missile onto, Zelensky's bedroom. And they've not done that. And Vladimir Putin said early on in this war, he was not going to kill Zelensky. He was not going to assassinate him. That's not what they were going to do. I think the Russians are clear about that. Also, too, you had this reality that the Russians and Ukrainians came so very close to a negotiated settlement, a negotiated deal in April 2022 that would have kept, as far as we know, the Zelensky government in power. So this also has to be a conversation the Russians have as well, right? Okay, who takes over? If we do get to this point of a negotiated settlement, what do we do? Is it politically acceptable to us in terms of our domestic audience? I'm speaking for the Russians here, to turn around and say, this is part of what victory looks like for us in Ukraine, is Zelensky staying in power. Can Putin sell that to his domestic audience? Because remember, a lot of people to what we would call Putin's right are in favor of a stronger hand in Ukraine. I mean, that's where most of the pressure comes from on Vladimir Putin, is this degree of, you're not fighting hard enough in Ukraine. This was the Wagner group, the dead leader of the Wagner group, Prigozhin, his chief complaint, you're not fighting hard enough. The man that Sergei Shoigu is taking over for as the secretary of the Security Council, Patrushev, he was, I believe, one of those who was also saying you're not doing it hard enough. So, I mean, would that be something that they could accept? So this is a fascinating thought of, okay, you get to this point, you have these negotiations, who then is acceptable, not just to the Russians, but of course to the Americans and the British and the rest of NATO, but then as well, who's acceptable to the Ukrainians? Who's going to have the validity that the Ukrainians are going to accept this person, this man or woman who was put into power as part of what everyone will understand, a defeat? Who is going to be able to take that and then have the political capital, the political space, the ability to manage and move Ukraine forward through that settlement and through post-year, reconciliation for the country as well as reconstruction?
Just to move to a little lighter note, the subject is dreadfully serious, but the statements by the chief spokesperson for the government of the United States of America are absurd. Cut number one.
There's been threats from Moscow in the last couple of days about striking British military facilities and also simulating nuclear drills as it sharply rises tensions because of weapons manufactured in the UK being used in the conflict. This says it could potentially apply to other allied countries as well, theoretically the United States. Do you have a response to that?
Well, what I'd say, number one, is it's just reckless and irresponsible for the leader of a major nuclear-armed power to be saber-rattling the way that he is with respect to potential use for nuclear weapons. We monitor this and have continued to monitor this very closely. I can tell you we've seen nothing, even despite the reckless rhetoric, that would cause us to change our strategic deterrent posture. And look, lastly, if Mr. Putin and Russian officials are worried about their troops in Ukraine getting hit with weapons from other countries, then the easiest thing to do is just take your troops and leave.
But that is just absurd for him to say that, to take your troops and leave. How about the natural, political, and legal right of the Russians to strike back at the British who are striking at them?
It's just such an infantile, childish thing to say that can you imagine being someone who's not familiar with this war, not familiar with this conversation, not familiar with John Kirby, to come across this? Right? I mean, like, you would just be so struck at the right. I mean, who this person is, a spokesperson for the National Security Council for the United States of America, and he makes these kinds of comments. And just as we talked about so many times before, the problem being is that when he turns around and goes back in the conference room and they talk policy, and the policy then is developed to support the previous narrative, not the current reality, this dominates that type of policy making. It's kind of like what I said before about don't let Blinken or Sullivan know you're making a list of who would take over or who would be a good person that would be acceptable to the Russians to take over in Kyiv in the event of a negotiated settlement. Don't let them know you're doing that. I mean, in this case, you know, you have Kirby saying things such as this idea that, well, our position is they should just, you know, if they don't like getting bombed, they should just go home. You know, how much of that actually infuses their decision making, right? Where you may have people at the NSC, at Pentagon, at CIA, state, wherever, who are trying to do their best to inform and educate and counsel their bosses, and they run into this type of attitude from Kirby of like, I don't want to hear it. They can just leave if they don't like it, you know, as opposed to, hey, you know, this is pretty serious. The Russians are saying they'll strike British targets if the Brits, right? And why do we not believe the Russians? They keep saying, these people in power and their apologists on television keep saying that, well, we've shown that the Russians don't really have red lines. The Russians have said these things before. They haven't enforced it. And it's as if they've completely forgotten about what the Russians did in Chechnya, what the Russians did in Syria, what the Russians did in Georgia. You know, the fact that, you know, basically this invasion that occurs in February 2022 comes after almost a decade of the Russians trying to negotiate and saying, look, if you don't talk to us, we're going to have to do something. And of course, fine, you know, in December of 21, they make one last ditch effort. You know, and you may scoff at what they put forward, but that's negotiations. You know, I mean, you might look at what the Russians put forward in December of 2021 and say, this is ridiculous. But, you know, as many say, including, say, Bernie Sanders, you don't go to the negotiating table asking for half a loaf of bread. Right. You know, I mean, so this is what negotiations look like. It looks preposterous to you because you're on the other side, and what you put forward is preposterous to them. But when you completely refuse negotiations, when you give your adversary no alternative, and when you then go forward with this mindset backed by this rhetoric, and your policy is determined by your narrative as opposed to the other way around, well, what can your adversary do? You know, and so the Russians at some point, God help us if this ever goes to this far, may well say, look, we told you we were going to strike these British targets if you used these British weapons against us.
Thank you, Matt. A pleasure, my dear friend. Much appreciated. And we'll look forward to seeing you next week.
All right. Thanks, Judge.